Hi, Misha here, and I have shown you this plane before, the LTV, formerly Vought, A7, and this is an A7E, Corsair. This was a light ground attack, subsonic, carrier-based aircraft that went into service at the end of the Vietnam War and actually served the U.S. Navy through the Gulf War, as well as the Air Force. And this model is, well, you can get them from both JC, Wings, and Gemini. This is available in 1/72 scale diecast, but what isn't available today is the aircraft this is based on, Vought's F-8 Crusader. And I finally have one. This is from Century Wings, but has not been made in a number of years. As far as I know, they're the only ones to do a full die-cast 1/72 scale model of the Crusader. I may be wrong, but as far as I know. And this has full features. Actually, it's pretty closely related to Old Hobbymaster. You know, removable pilot, opening canopy, removable ordnance, gear up or down. And while I normally do not do this, after waiting for a model shop to come up with one or something, I finally just rolled the dice on an eBay purchase. Now, eBay, for anyone, can be a little iffy, but imagine not being able to see photographs. But I found one. They've been bringing pretty crazy money, as these models tend to do when they're out of stock. But I found one that had the inner box and the inner plastic clamshell and all the accessories, but it was missing the outer box, so your dyed and the wool collectors weren't interested, but I don't care. I threw my boxes away. And it came in, and here we go. Everything is here. It has the stand. It came with all the ordnance. Came with the landing gear. All that good stuff. So, with that in mind, I thought we would talk a bit about the last of the gunfighters, or as some call it, the MiG Master of Vietnam. And I just brought out the A7 for comparison. I'm sure this won't be the only video I do on this aircraft. But with that said, let's dive in a bit to its history. I have a feeling this one might be difficult for me to get in frame, so I apologize. Anywho, the Crusader is kind of a spiritual successor to Vought's F-4U Corsair from World War II. A very fast, a very high-performance aircraft, but also a bit of a challenging aircraft. Sorry, I'm getting stuck by a spring in my chest. I think it's a G3 stock. Anyway, yep. This really goes back to 1952 when the U.S. Navy announced that it needed a new fighter. So this was right in the middle of the Korean War. And it laid out some pretty stiff specifications. It needed to be supersonic, capable of Mach 1.2 or greater. But at the same time, it needed to have a landing speed of 100 miles per hour or less. They also wanted it to be armed with 4 20mm cannon, because they had decided that 50 caliber machine guns just weren't cutting it anymore. Keep in mind, they were going up against the MiG-15, and soon they would start encountering the MiG-17 in years to come, which had larger guns. Of course, it needed to be able to operate off a carrier and all that entails. And really in the early part of 1953, several designs from about 8 companies were evaluated. And Vought's submission was known as the V-383, and it was a very interesting aircraft for that time. It used quite a powerful engine, about the same engine as the F-100 Super Sabre. It was afterburner capable, although you couldn't throttle it. It didn't have zones, it was just on or off. Titanium was used as much as possible. The tailplane, the horizontal, moved entirely. But more unique, the wing could move up and down about 7 degrees. And this was done for carrier landings, to get that landing speed they needed, but also be a fast aircraft. It was, as the Navy specified, armed with 4 20mm cannon, and much like the F-86D Sabre Dog, originally it had a tray that would open up on the bottom that had 32 folding fin unguided rockets. This would be a daytime fighter. That's what the Navy was wanting. At this time, night fighters and day fighters were still separated. So this competition was for a day fighter. Its biggest competitor was the Grumman F-11F. But also, there was the F-3H Demon, which was kind of a forerunner of what would become the F-4 Phantom. But nevertheless, in May of '53, the Vought proposal was chosen, and then in June, 3 prototypes were ordered. And they went into construction, designing, finishing out stuff. The first prototype was ready. At this time, it was designated as the XF-8U-1. X for experimental, F 8 was the model, and U was for Vought. Soon the name Crusader would start being used as well. With the first one ready in February of '55, it would fly on March 25th for the first time. And it would actually break the sound barrier on its maiden flight. Originally, they were going to do 3 prototypes, but they actually only ended up doing 1 more prototype, which flew on September 30th. And then the third plane built was actually a production model that flew the same day, because honestly, just development and all that went very smoothly. Vought at this point was pretty much an old hand at carrier aircraft. Throughout 1956, you would have various testing. It would enter into carrier trials, of course, weapons testing. Certain squadrons would start to receive it in December of that year. And by '57, it was in service, going on board the USS Roosevelt and USS Saratoga, with one of its first cruises being in the Mediterranean. Now, it's worth pointing out that something that was integrated into the design quite early on were 2 hard points kind of on the chin of the fuselage for the new, at the time, AIM-9 Sidewinder missile, because it was quickly becoming apparent that those rockets were outdated by the late 50s. In fact, later versions would completely get rid of them. In 1957, this would actually set several records. The F-8U, as it was known at the time, would be the first American fighter to exceed 1,000 miles per hour. It would also be the first to make a supersonic transcontinental flight. Actually, that was being piloted by John Glenn, and was kind of a hot rod for its day, and it flew like it. It flew in the air, it was quite fast and maneuverable. It was a bit of a challenge to take off, but it was really quite a challenge for pilots to land, hence the famous nickname of Ensign Eliminator. It just, much like the F-4U before, it wasn't the most forgiving plane. So in the hands of a skilled pilot, it was great, but it was a very advanced plane for its day and time. So throughout the late 50s and early 60s, these started to get deployed. In September of 62, the new joint naming system would come into use. The F-8U would become the F-8, and the -1 would become the A for what it is. And then beginning on October 23rd of that year, the variant of this, the reconnaissance variant, the photographic variant known as the RF-8, would really get the craft its first true use. Went for 6 weeks. They would fly from Key West over Cuba, taking photographs, and then landing in Jacksonville, Florida, where the film would be immediately collected and rushed to the CIA and others for reconnaissance to see what the Soviets were up to. So, of course, this was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Crusader reconnaissance variant played a major role in that. This was the Navy's primary daytime dogfighter in the early 60s. And actually, it was there at the very beginning of the Vietnam War. A squad of F-8s was launched from USS Ticonderoga to intercept torpedo boats allegedly attacking the USS Maddox destroyer. And when they were chasing them off, a couple of the Crusaders would use their cannon and also a couple of missiles to shoot and eventually sink one of the boats. August 2nd, 1964, thus beginning the U.S.'s active participation in the Vietnam War. And of course, the F-8 would be right there too. The Crusader would definitely be used for multiple roles in Vietnam. Every Navy carrier would have them on board. They could actually fly from the smaller Essex classes, unlike the F-4 Phantom, which was just coming into use at the beginning of Vietnam. It required the largest Nimitz classes of the day. They were pretty adaptable. They were used mostly to engage the MiG-17 in the air role, but they did fight the MiG-21. A lot of times they were used for fleet defense. They were used for escort. They often escorted the A-4 Skyhawk early on. The Marines would also fly the F-8. but they would use it more as a close air support or even strike bomber. And that gets us to versions. Now there's quite a few. This is the F-8E. The A was originally the day superiority. The B introduced a little bit of all-weather capability with the radar. The C would introduce these double pylons for Sidewinder missiles on the nose or on the cheek. Alternatively, they could also fire, I get one over here. They could also carry a double Zuni rocket pack with a total of 4 rockets there. So 2 on each cheek for a total of 8 instead of just Sidewinders. It being used in a ground attack ability. So this is really the first. This is kind of coming along. The D variant, F-8D, would finally just completely get rid of that unguided rocket tray. Earlier versions, even going as far back as the B, would weld it over sometimes, fix it closed. With the D, they would just get rid of it and put another fuel tank there. And by the time of the E, the D also introduced more all-weather ability. It became almost a pretty capable day-night fighter. By the time of the E, we have a larger payload. While pilots preferred these in an air configuration, which is what I have mine set up here, with 4 Sidewinders and then the 420mm cannon, they did have one hard point under each wing, and they could carry basically dumb bombs. The E version also introduced compatibility with the Bullpup guided air-to-surface missile. You can this model does come with a bomb rack for each wing. I just kind of like it in a clean configuration, even though it is technically a Marine. But the Marines did do some air-to-air escort and combat too. But yeah, this was just kind of what the Navy needed it to be, and subsequent versions were more and more improved. They would engage the MiGs several times, including a very famous bombing raid over Hanoi in 1967. However, by that time, these would start to be phased out in many roles, including by the F-4 Phantom by McDonnell Douglas, and a short time later, even by Vought's own A-7 Corsair. The Crusader is credited with 15 or 16, depending who you ask, MiG-17 victories and 3 MiG-21 victories, so 18 to 19 MiGs shot down. And the U.S. claims that only 3 Crusaders were downed by MiGs. Now, in terms of absolute numbers, it was the 3rd most numerous MiG killer in Vietnam. The F-4 was, of course, number 1, and the F-105 Thunder Chief was number 2. But many more of those were lost, especially in air-to-air combat, than the Crusader, so it kind of just earned a reputation as being very survivable against MiGs. Of course, in the whole war, they would lose about 170 total, but about 50 were because of ground fire, SAM missiles. And then the rest were just through various accidents. Remember, like I said, it was considered an ensign killer. It was challenging at times. And other planes were damaged, did return home, but were total write-offs. The U.S. Navy would take delivery of 1,219, with the final delivery in September of 1964. And they had one other customer, France, who operated aircraft carriers in the same time period, but their carriers were quite small, whereas Britain was able to use the F-4 Phantom, barely, but they were able to make it work. France just didn't have large enough carriers for it, so they ended up selecting the F-8 after borrowing a couple from the U.S. Navy to try them out on their carriers. And they ordered 42 from Vought, and they were delivered between October of 1964 and February of 1965. This would be the final production run of all new airframes, bringing the total up to 1,261. Even though this was sometimes being replaced later in the stages of Vietnam, it was still in service, front line, through the rest of the war, and even afterwards. The last two frontline squadrons handed in and transitioned away from their Crusaders in 1976. However, the photo reconnaissance version continued to fly and prove a valuable asset. It was retired out of frontline service in 1982, and then the final squad in the Naval Reserves handed theirs in 1987. But in France, their version, known as the F-8E FN, at least by Vought, continued to serve until it was finally replaced in 1999-2000 by the Dassault Rafale. The only other user was the Philippines, who purchased 35 U.S. Navy surplus Crusaders in 1977. Vought would get a contract to refurbish and upgrade 25 of them to the F-8H standard, and the other 10 were just kept in the Philippines for spare parts, spare airframes, what have you. But they would only fly them actively through the mid to late 80s, and then they would finally retire them officially in 1991, and they were just scrapped. They were worn out at that point. The Crusader is interesting because throughout the 40s and 50s, until this came along, the U.S. Navy had been going through a series of aircraft very quickly. This was the first one that really stuck around for a couple of decades. It had good performance. It could get over Mach 1.8, had a max altitude of 58,000 feet. And later versions, like the E here, could carry a payload of 5,000 pounds. Like I said, I have mine set up in an air-to-air with 4 sidewinders, but you could put, this also comes with, where are they at here? Single sidewinders for the chin. This would be more used for ground missions when they were carrying bombs. But really, it was the A7 that was a dedicated attacker. This was developed in the mid-60s from the F-8. Went into service in 67, appeared in Vietnam 1970. Saw heavy use in 73. It could carry 15,000 pounds. It had a total of 8 hard points, although 2 of them were again just for Sidewinder missiles for defense. Instead of having 4 20mm cannon, it had one 20mm Vulcan cannon, and lots of fancy electronics. On the other hand, it was subsonic. It could only get up to about 690 miles per hour and had a max altitude of 42,000 feet. The Crusader was longer at about 54 feet. The Corsair was about 46 feet long, but the Corsair had a wider wingspan of over 38 feet, whereas the Crusader had a shorter wingspan of about 35.5 feet. This was clearly designed as a dogfighter, at least first and foremost, and this was clearly designed as an attack light bomber. And actually, as Vought was no longer making Crusaders, they would start making Corsairs for not only the U.S. Navy, but also the Marines and even the Air Force. They would produce them through the 70s, making nearly 1,600. And these guys would stay in service through the first Gulf War, being retired out between 91 and 93 afterwards. So they definitely carry on the tradition, and they had a lot of firsts just like the F-8 before them, including the first heads-up display. They had a hands-off landing system. I think they finally kind of figured that one out as far as the F-8, but of course this was less of a hot rod. But it still had a similar wing and body. So I thought I'd just bring it out for comparison. Plus, again, this is the Gemini model. You can see my video I did on this a while back. But yeah, I've really been wanting an F-8 to round out my collection, and I kept hoping someone might start doing them again, but they haven't. I am pleased with the model. It's very metal. It plugs into its stand very securely. The ordnance, the landing gear, everything plugs on. It's a nice quality model. I'm sure I'll talk more about it. I kind of want to compare it with the F-11F and even the F-4, so I'll do that in another video. I just wanted to show you a new pickup I had. Anyway, I appreciate you tuning in and staying with me. Any questions, comments, feel free to post them below. As always, thank you very much, and I'll catch you very soon next time.